In this presentation, we look at the mystery of the creation of the greatest and most valuable African map, the map done by cartographer Jean-Benjamin de la Borde, based on Le Vaillant's travels and intended as a gift for King Louis XVI of France. The frontispiece of Le Vaillant's travels, published in 1790, shows him in his characteristic hunter's coat and ostrich-plumed hat. It shows him on the banks of the Orange River, discovering the giraffe that he brought back to France. And this was a highly influential text, the most translated text about South Africa till Nelson Mandela some 200 years later. So here we give some clues about how to look at this map, particularly as there's now a wonderful zoom function available through the Bibliothèque Nationale website, and there'll be a URL given later. So this is a way of exploring the map and trying to understand how it got made. So who was Jean-Benjamin de la Borde? If one looks him up, one will find that he was a tax collector, what the French call a farmer general. He's noted particularly as a musician and collector of music, with a whole research project on his life as a musician going on in Australia. He was a collector of music, he was a writer, he eventually became governor of the Louvre. But he's also notorious or famous for his role in other realms. De la Borde was friendly with the philosopher Voltaire, who regarded him as one of the greatest minds of his age, and there's a famous portrait of de la Borde visiting Voltaire in his old age. In this presentation, we look at the mystery of the creation of the greatest and most valuable African map, the map done by cartographer Jean-Benjamin de la Borde, based on Le Vaillant's travels and intended as a gift for King Louis XVI of France. And now de la Borde has emerged as a character, even in a detective series written by the French writer Jean-François Parot, and de la Borde as a recurring figure in the detective stories that have even been turned into a French television series. The frontispiece of Le Vaillant's travels, published in 1790, shows him in his characteristic hunter's coat and ostrich-plumed hat. It shows him on the banks of the Orange River, discovering the giraffe that he brought back to France. And this was a highly influential text, the most translated text about South Africa till Nelson Mandela some 200 years later. But the film gets Madame de Vismus wrong. She's a powerful figure, a poet, the Queen's confidant. She's not someone sent off as a sacrificial victim, and in fact lives on and remarries successfully in France. This portrait gives a rather more likely picture of her power, where she's acting almost as a reader to Marie Antoinette at court, and she was the femme de lit, or close confidant of the Queen. De la Borde was friendly with the philosopher Voltaire, who regarded him as one of the greatest minds of his age, and there's a famous portrait of de la Borde visiting Voltaire in his old age. So how did de la Borde, who is scarcely known as a cartographer, produce this amazing map of Le Vaillant's travels? Well, thanks to the Bibliothèque Nationale map section and its wonderfully digitized zoom possibilities, we can see that in fact he did a lot of preparatory work, producing two kinds of maps that were particularly helpful. One was map based on French travelers. He'd look at their travels and try and produce a map based on those. And the second was the king asked him to make instructional maps for the Dauphin, the king's son and heir. So one can see that de la Borde had a privileged position close to the court under the Louis XVI, but he's also combining different elements in interesting ways in these maps: history, geography, politics. And I think those combinations helped him when he came to making the King's map. In this presentation, we look at the mystery of the creation of the greatest and most valuable African map, the map done by cartographer Jean-Benjamin de la Borde, based on Le Vaillant's travels and intended as a gift for King Louis XVI of France. The frontispiece of Le Vaillant's travels, published in 1790, shows him in his characteristic hunter's coat and ostrich-plumed hat. It shows him on the banks of the Orange River, discovering the giraffe that he brought back to France. And this was a highly influential text, the most translated text about South Africa till Nelson Mandela some 200 years later. But the film gets Madame de Vismus wrong. She's a powerful figure, a poet, the Queen's confidant. She's not someone sent off as a sacrificial victim, and in fact lives on and remarries successfully in France. This portrait gives a rather more likely picture of her power, where she's acting almost as a reader to Marie Antoinette at court, and she was the femme de lit, or close confidant of the Queen. So Le Vaillant's travels come out and are something of a publishing sensation. Le Vaillant says somewhere, I woke one day and found myself famous, rather like the English poet Byron said. It was a bestseller, but it was interesting. The king obviously loved it, but it was also praised by the Revolutionary Parliament. So Le Vaillant's politics were ambiguous enough for everybody to think highly of the book. And there's a very important review by the famous writer Chamfort. But perhaps the most important review was one which dealt specifically with the question of the map. So how did de la Borde, who is scarcely known as a cartographer, produce this amazing map of Le Vaillant's travels? Well, thanks to the Bibliothèque Nationale map section and its wonderfully digitized zoom possibilities, we can see that in fact he did a lot of preparatory work, producing two kinds of maps that were particularly helpful. Indigenous writes, the travels that we've been told about were not accompanied by a map, which was absolutely necessary to understand the author and to follow him in these unknown countries. And we would have much preferred to have a map to the paintings or the illustrations he had of the life of the Hottentots and so on. So perhaps we can play detectives and say that this review might have set off some thinking. Maybe Marie Antoinette read it and said to Madame de Vismus, wouldn't it be nice if your husband could do a map for the king? Maybe the king went to de la Borde directly and said, I've loved Le Vaillant's travels, but really one should do something about the fact that there isn't a map, just as this review says. And it seems to me that's a likely chain of events to explain how de la Borde got involved in making the king's map. But there's an obvious puzzle about the map. Why is it so big? Compared to de la Borde's other maps or most other maps produced at the time, this map is enormous. And when the map was being installed at the exhibition in Ezekiel Museum in Cape Town, the French authorities informed me that, in fact, King Louis XVI had a special map room upstairs at Versailles with large places to put maps on a wall, and he could spend time there and in a sense relive the voyages that he'd read about. So perhaps this was intended for the king's private viewing. But there's another possibility. When he was in Cape Town, Le Vaillant collaborated with Colonel Robert Gordon, who helped him considerably with his travels, and Gordon himself had done a large map, almost as wide as Le Vaillant's, but not nearly as tall. But in this map, Gordon had recorded his travels into the interior. So it may well be that Le Vaillant had seen Gordon's map and been inspired by it. So how good was the map? And the first thing it needs to be said is that the map was geographically inaccurate in an age where map makers were getting increasingly concerned about accuracy. So this map was a bit of a throwback to earlier conventions where, in a way, de la Borde had to put in interesting stuff because the map's accuracy was very uncertain. And partly this was the fault of earlier models. Earlier travels like Sparman had already gone wrong and thought they'd gone further east and north than they had. But Le Vaillant also probably exaggerated how far he had traveled. Nonetheless, there's a link there which will take you to the Bibliothèque Nationale website, and I would urge people to use the Zoom facility because it will enable you to go into the incredible detail of the map. So in the next few slides, we can highlight some of the innovations in the map. The papillon, the French word for butterflies, or little stickies that enabled the map to show wonderful visual detail. We can look at the ways in which it shows animal distribution. We can go back to the way in which the route that was traveled was shown. And the map goes back to things that were in the story that probably had interested the king, and where he might have said, I want to know where this incident took place. And then, of course, what's interesting is that there was flattery of the king, but also Le Vaillant himself appears in the map. And I think that's interesting, where the traveler takes a prominent role in the map. So perhaps we can play detectives and say that this review might have set off some thinking. Maybe Marie Antoinette read it and said to Madame de Vismus, wouldn't it be nice if your husband could do a map for the king? Maybe the king went to de la Borde directly and said, I've loved Le Vaillant's travels, but really one should do something about the fact that there isn't a map, just as this review says. And it seems to me that's a likely chain of events to explain how de la Borde got involved in making the king's map. And in this painting, or this detail, we can see that de la Borde drew on that earlier convention of the dotted line for showing the route. Here we get Le Vaillant, the red line showing the route as he goes east, past Swellen Dam. But at each campsite, you have a little French flag flying for the pride of the king, but also a wonderful detail of the blowbook, the first African mammal that we know went extinct in the modern age. Le Vaillant's hunter shot one of those in that area. So you also see the detail of animal distribution being accurate. But this line enabled the king, or enabled viewers, to follow Le Vaillant's route on his travels east and then his later travels north. This slide shows the area around Saldanha Bay, and illustrates the ways in which the map showed details of the story. There are three important details here. At the bottom, you see view of the premier tiger, which is the leopard, where Le Vaillant is confronted by a leopard. We see the tomb of a Danish captain, and you also see the site where the Middelburg sank, the vessel on which Le Vaillant's first collection had been stored, but was destroyed when an English fleet came in and captured the Dutch ships in the bay. So in other words, the map gives details to reinforce the text and to illustrate, if you like, the truth or the geographical accuracy of it. And perhaps these were details that the king had been particularly interested in. And of course, the map wasn't above flattering Louis XVI. Here there's a plant that they seem to have named after him. Botanists who looked at this don't really think it's a local plant, but nonetheless, it's got this nice name, the sceptre of Louis XVI. Other kings had plants named after them, so clearly de la Borde and perhaps Le Vaillant thought it would be politic to name something after Louis XVI. The central cartouche or illustrated panel in the map shows Le Vaillant with his dog. On the right, you have his trusty helper Klaas and Klaas's wife Rachel. And under the tree on the left, you have his baboon Kies. So once again, important actors in the story are assembled here. But what's particularly interesting is surely that Le Vaillant, with his rifle, is free in Africa. He's hunting. And people of his station weren't allowed to hunt in France. So in a way, he's breaking the French rules. And I think perhaps the king looked at him enviously and thought, this is a wonderful adventure. The king, of course, is very much stuck in France at this point. And here's a closer up detail of the previous panel. We see Le Vaillant once again with his ostrich plume hat and his green hunting coat, very much branded with this outfit that he wears. And once again, we see him free in nature, enviable. Le Vaillant is the founding figure of African ornithology. And the map is wonderful in terms of the birds it shows, and some birds which aren't even shown anywhere else in Le Vaillant. But 3 birds are incorrect. They're birds which actually come from Senegal. The central bird, for example, is the northern ground hornbill, not the southern ground hornbill. And Le Vaillant made it clear that he'd never seen the southern ground hornbill. So what seems to have happened is that de la Borde decided one had gone so far north in the map, one might as well put some Senegalese birds in. So if you like, this is where de la Borde, perhaps with Le Vaillant's collaboration, decided that we'd push the limits a bit and put in birds that were likely to start coming into the area if one went far enough north. So this is interesting, the way in which at the time the French drew on their knowledge from Senegal to start thinking about what was happening in South Africa. The story, of course, as far as de la Borde and Louis XVI were concerned, has an unhappy ending. Both are guillotined. De la Borde, because he'd been a tax collector, was regarded with suspicion, and his wonderful library of 25,000 volumes was burned. And how did the map survive? The map survived because it was put into a military archive. Someone decided it had military value or thought this might be a way to preserve it. We don't even know if Le Vaillant saw the finished product or knew if it had survived or not. Nonetheless, it was wonderfully stored and restored in the French archives and moved around during World War I and then World War II. And very fortunately for people who love African exploration, 222 years after it was made, it was exhibited in Cape Town. And whatever the rights and wrongs of Louis XVI and de la Borde, we can say this is a wonderful part of their legacy, probably the most wonderful map of Southern Africa ever made.